You have to look at, customers in general today, right? This prospects, they're so challenged to have, attention. They're bombarded by so many different marketing messages per day. I mean, I saw a statistic recently that just kind of blew me away by when you combine social media with what you're hearing, whether it be on your podcast, your radio, or your television, the amount of stuff that's coming at us continually really by nature really causes us to put up a lot of walls as individuals. So we're not hearing, a chunk of what's being said. So when you come at things a little bit differently and you have a little bit different approach than anybody else that's actually trying to get their attention, that actually stands out and people pay attention to those things. They may not.
Thank you so much for tuning into Journey with Christian D. Evans podcast. I'm your host, as always, Christian D. Evans. Now, most of us, we want to go out there and scale our business. Most of us think, oh, it's about sales, adding more sales people on our team, or making more training. But what if I told you it's actually this one word? This one word is what you're missing in your business to take to the next level. Well, that's the reason why I have this next individual on. He is the CEO and founder of SWAT Vision, which is a holding company for several software companies and other different things. But he's also a serial entrepreneur, professional speaker, author, and leading business strategist. He has successfully uncovered the secret of creating powerful, long-lasting connections and their impact on one's personal and professional life. He is the author and founder of Ripple Effect, which is just a huge, massive movement in building long-term lasting relationships. Please welcome my friend, Steve Harper. How you doing today, Steve?
I'm doing great. Happy to be here, Christian. Thanks for having me.
Man, I'm very excited about this because what's so interesting about this whole situation is it doesn't matter how many times we say this, and it's about, this one word, but people still mess it up because it is short-term versus long-term thinking. And that's
Yeah.
really what it comes down to. But before we dive into all the fun stuff and actually applicable aspects on how to apply this into your business, into your B2B, into the B2C, into working with your customers and culturally, Steve, I'd love to ask, tell me at what point in your life story did it hit you and like this is the reason why this is what I need to be focusing on, not transactional?
Well, yeah, it's a great question. So I started my first company at the age of 22, and I went to work within the Xerox structure. So I was selling office equipment for the first part of my career, and we were an agent for Xerox. So we were sort of we were an independent company, but essentially repping their products and helping them build market share. And they, as many people know, they had sort of a well-known sales process and approach, like many of the companies at the time did, IBM and some of those larger, organizations that were selling and beginning to sell into the tech world. But what I had found in my market was that they had lacked authentic connection to their customers. And probably even before I put the term the ripple effect together, what I was really recognizing is that you had to figure out how to not talk about speeds and feeds and features and benefits and trying to drive value. You couldn't drive any of those things to any successful conclusion unless you actually made an attempt to get to know the other person across the side of the desk, right? And so what I really sort of realized early on in my entrepreneurial career was the quicker that I could get to know people, figure out how to add value, even if they didn't necessarily need exactly what I had. If I had a strong network and I had, sort of the ability to leverage that network to maybe help solve a problem or provide a solution to something that might be on their plate right then, well, you're adding value and you're creating that, first connection, and then you're building trust, and then you're developing a relationship from there. And that was really when it kind of hit me, right? So I did that for a number of years. I actually ended up getting out of the Xerox program and started a dealership, which under the same premise to do it differently than the competitors were doing, and building it completely from the relationship was front and center, most important on everything we did.
Let me ask you this in regards to, because it's totally different with definitely with all these sales techniques, and it's very culturally, it's like all this fun stuff, all these, okay, how to close that person, how to, kind of, twist their arm a little bit. And it's either, the cold sales, or it's more of like, hey, there's a lot of different sales techniques regarding
Yeah.
it. But I
Yeah.
love now that you kind of position it to a relational aspect, how did that affect, and I get a little technical, how did that affect the sales cycle, right?
Yeah.
Did it take a little longer? And then as well as though on the back end, what was the result, the lifetime value of that?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And you hit on it right there, is that I think most people in sales don't understand the concept of lifetime value. They're looking purely at the transactional. Can I get this deal closed? Can I make something happen now? And rather than necessarily, and those are critical, right? You've got to move the needle, you got to grow the business, you have to meet your quota, et cetera. But at the end of the day, one of the things that I've always professed to any sales professional that I've personally trained is that what's it going to take to grow that connection into a real relationship with your customer? Because as a sales professional, you never really find that those individuals have to work as hard as what I call sales reps, right? Sales reps are all about, got to get that next one. Yeah, I got to go out, I got to hunt, I got to, kill what I eat, et cetera. And then I got to start again, tomorrow. And the reality is sales professionals do it differently. Sales professionals look at that connection that they have to that customer. If they're solving a need, whether it's through a product or a service, they're adding value. They don't just stop there. They get to know that person. They get to figure out how they can potentially add value in other capacities to that person, even if it is just being a resource or leveraging their network to benefit. Those folks start to actually realize that you're not just there just to sell them something. You're there because you want to be there, because you want to add value and contribute. And the cool thing about that is when that happens, the light bulb goes off. And when they hear somebody talking at a networking event or a cocktail party about, a similar product or service to what you offer, you become that person that's top of mind to them. They become your evangelist. And so sales professionals, when I say they don't have to work as hard, they put in a lot of work, right? But at the end of the day, those customers actually become their de facto sales organization because they are there wanting to add value back to that relationship and contribute by providing referrals or recommendations to their network to do business with you. And so I think that's one of the key factors, is that when you can take the time to build that momentum, yeah, and it does take time, right? I'm not going to, tell you that this is some sort of magic formula that's going to start paying off like a slot machine tomorrow. But if you have 10 really solid customers that are keeping their eyes and ears open for opportunity for you, and they're putting your name out there, into those conversations, good things just start to happen. And that's where the momentum carries. And if you take care of the folks that they bring to you just as well as you took care of them, well, that just continues to keep that ball rolling, right? So, as I like to say, it keeps those ripples rippling on.
It's interesting you mentioned this. So let's kind of dive deep into this a little bit, okay? Because, you know, um, there is, and I am very guilty of this. So this is the reason why I'm bringing this up a little bit on the front end. I used to run a business, and it was very, I mean, we did very well financially, but the biggest thing is we were doing one call closes. We were doing a lot of sales techniques to get them in the door or whatever, and it worked. It grew. But then as I become a little bit more prevalent in the podcasting space, I started realizing it is about networking and connecting, building
Yeah.
relationships. And of course, I love to just get you've been in the industry way longer than I have. And so, speaking an author and just doing incredible things in this space. And so, what have you found are like the one or two things that majority of people are getting wrong? And then as well as what do you think people need to implement right away that could really help them, see that impact in the bottom line?
Well, I mean, I think that you hear in the sales game that it's a numbers game, right? The more people that you can talk to, the more conversations you can have, the more people you can sort of socialize with at a networking event. It's all about the numbers, and I think people get lost in that. So that's one mistake. Is I would much rather have two or three quality conversations at an event with people and get to know them and be able to establish at least the baseline of a potential connection there, as opposed to have 20 connections that at the end of the night, I'm walking away with 20 business cards and I don't remember a single conversation, right? So that's one. The other thing I would say is the very serious lack of follow up. If you have a great connection with someone, the reality is you don't just fire off a LinkedIn request to them to say, hey, let's become, LinkedIn, let's bring, one another into each other's LinkedIn network. It doesn't work that way. I see a lot of people do that. And I think that the reality is, and that's a whole different side topic as to why I don't think that's a great way to do it. But at the end of the day, you haven't even actually built up enough trust in order to say, hey, look, I'd like to be a part of your network and I'd like you to be a part of mine. I think a more authentic follow-up is, hey, a handwritten note if you happen to capture their details, where you can send something to their office address or whatever information that they may share with you. Be able to just say, look, I really enjoyed that conversation. I really would love to continue that at some point, maybe over coffee, over lunch, right? Not trying to push an agenda, not trying to sell them on why they should talk to you about your company, your product, or your service, but really just like that interaction that you can have that started the spark really at whatever interaction that you had to initially connect. You've exchanged your contact information, but really be able to take it to the next level where people are like, hey, look, this person is somebody I really want to get to know a little deeper as well. So I think that's really critical. I think that, those mistakes can be overcome without question. I think if you stop looking at people as everybody as a number or a transaction, and people as individuals, and figure out how you can really engage them so that you can really get to know them, what's important to them, what are some of their challenges, what are they all about, what is important to them. And if you can find an avenue to be able to add some value or contribute in some small way, it is just it's worth its weight in gold. I just had a situation where I met somebody recently through a colleague, and through the course of having some good questions, getting this person to open up a little bit, and it was a very brief interaction, like we're talking 10 or 15 minutes at the most. Well, one of the things that I learned was that they were really interested in pursuing something, a script that they had written specifically for, they thought maybe a one-person play, maybe a potential short, video or something that they wanted to do. And I just happened to offer, I said, hey, I was really intrigued by, this was in the follow-up, your script. And yeah, I've always wanted to learn how to do that myself. I'm really curious about it. Did you go to school for it? Did you read a book? That got the conversation started, right? So I wasn't like trying to pursue the script. I wasn't trying to be one of these people that's kind of a poser. Oh, you need to meet this person or you need to meet that person. I actually started with, I had a genuine interest in what was the motivation behind it. So that led to a follow-up. That follow-up ended up being a phenomenal conversation. And at the end, they said, hey, I'm looking for a few of these specific, connections. Maybe somebody, or maybe you have some experience. Not having written a script myself, I didn't necessarily have anybody that could specifically help in that perspective, but I had known some people that had been out in Hollywood, had relocated to Austin where I'm at, and they were great potential resources. I said, hey, I'd be happy to bridge a connection for you. I don't know where that conversation might lead. Fast forward a month, and one of the connections that I made for them is actually helping them make connections out to potentially turn this thing into something significant. So it's those things. And again, I didn't go into it asking for anything. I don't want, I don't want a lead fee. I don't want any kind of, compensation for it. I was just genuinely interested in what they were doing. And I think when you show up with an authentic heart and you have that sort of, mindset to create positivity for other people when and where you can, good things just come back and help you. They just tend to help.
It's interesting because I think logically people hear this stuff and it's like, okay, yeah, that makes sense, and they do it for a little while, but then all of a sudden the reason why they don't stay consistent is because at the end of the day they're thinking so short term and transactional. Because guess what? At the end of the day, hey, I got kids college education I got to pay for. Hey, I got
Yeah.
insurance to pay for. I got things to pay for, right? And
Yeah.
so even though we say this stuff, it's like, oh, it makes sense. However, though, I do want to, and I really want to foot stomp on what you're saying, because the value of it long term is so beautiful. And I love for you to, just like you mentioned with that regard, you didn't make any compensation, but it was goodwill. And so guess what? Now they're in your ecosystem. Now, guess what? Whenever you maybe have a power of the ask and say, hey, do you know anybody that's looking for XYZ? They'll most likely return the favor because you had that goodwill. And it's not that you're going in there anticipating that at some point. You just added value to that person just because you could, and you did. And I think that's really awesome. So let me ask you this in regards to making sure that people walk away from that transactional aspect to that transformational, right?
Yep.
And that's kind of what the ripple effect is it's explain that. I love for you to maybe explain that, how integrating that into our companies culturally into our teams, making sure that as we grow, hey, that's part of the culture where we're adding value, we're building relationships, maybe even explain that to the sales team and saying, hey, at the end of the day, I don't want to sell, I want a relationship first. And then obviously we know what that's going to produce. So explain that, how you've been able to integrate that into your companies.
Well, it really comes down to the filter that we have in life, right? And the people that we interact with. Some folks have the mindset, which is, sort of beaten into our heads in a lot of ways, the what's in it for me mindset. You touched on that, where it's transactional. I call it relational, but I like your transformational as well, because there is some serious value there when you start looking at people not as a number, but as individuals. And you never know where the potential opportunities might grow. And just because it may not be obvious today doesn't mean it won't become obvious tomorrow, next year, 5 years from now. So I would say, the advice that I would give to organizations and to individuals that are looking at doing things differently is, am I looking at everybody that comes across, whether it's someone I meet at an event, somebody that sends me a random email, someone that, was introduced to me by another person. Am I looking at that individual as what's in it for me to spend time, get to know them, interact, how quick I can try and sell? Or am I approaching it what's in it for them, right? What can I be doing to add value, to make this person just a little bit better for knowing me in some capacity? And I think for sales teams, I think the big challenge that you run into is because there is this urgency to make the quota, to make the number, to hit the marks. And a lot of sales managers still want to quantify what you're doing day to day by, how many cold calls did you make? How many, in-person appointments did you have? How many demos did you do on whatever it is, right? Those are quantifiables that, people get, comfortable, but they also get lazy in building, some, sort of comfort around those things. Like that's really moving the needle. The reality is, the conversations that really need to take place are really geared around, am I speaking to the people that probably need what I have, right? Number one, that's kind of sales 101. Am I fishing in the right ponds? And number two, am I coming across in the way that I want them to look at me as a salesperson or as an authority figure, right? Someone that's a professional that's coming across that says, hey, look, yes, if you need what I have, I'm a resource and I'm providing value. But I don't know if we'll get there today or tomorrow or a year from now, but I would be willing to put up put in my energy and my time, to put my money where my mouth is, to show up authentically and try and see what I can learn about your business, the challenges that you might have, the issues that might be occurring. Maybe some of those things can be addressed by whatever my product or service is. Maybe it's not, but maybe I know somebody who knows somebody who can actually help in that capacity. I think that's the issue, right? And you have to look at, customers in general today, right? This prospects, they're so challenged to have, attention. They're bombarded by so many different marketing messages per day. I mean, I saw a statistic recently that just kind of blew me away by when you combine social media with what you're hearing, whether it be on your podcast, your radio, or your television, the amount of stuff that's coming at us continually really by nature really causes us to put up a lot of walls as individuals. So we're not hearing, a chunk of what's being said. So when you come at things a little bit differently and you have a little bit different approach than anybody else that's actually trying to get their attention, that actually stands out and people pay attention to those things. They may not necessarily trust it right away because we've become a society of being very, very suspicious of anybody doing things differently. But just like what I was talking about with that scenario is just showing up and saying, look, if I can add some value to this person, I want to do it. And because of that, those things tend to come back to me in ways that you really can't imagine. I really do call that the ripple effect. It's essentially like casting that stone. You take that action, that's your rock, you cast it, that splash, your rock is your action that goes. You don't know how ideally how deep that action can go, how big of an impact it might make on that other person. But what happens is that ripple ripples out, but it always ripples back to that center. People always remember how you make them feel, the approach that you take, how respectful you are to them. how inquisitive you are about what they're doing, and doing it in a respectful way, so you're not coming across as, stalker Steve, right? At the end of the day, there's a limit to certain things that you can approach until you've built some rapport with these people. But at the end of the day, if you just show up and say, look, my entire goal and intent in meeting you today over coffee or coming into your office is I just want to get acquainted. I'd like to, learn a little bit about you, your business, and see if there's some ways that, I might be able to add some value, whether it's through my product or service or just me in general.
So let me talk a little bit about this, because you mentioned this, just like the same thing with like a sales process, right?
Sure.
Obviously Jordan Belfort talks about like the straight line, and there's obviously certain questions that elicit certain emotions, and there's different processes. So I'd love to kind of unpack the relational aspect conversation. What does that look like? What questions do you, because you mentioned that a little bit, and I really want to just kind of sit in this for a second, because as much training there is in the sales world, I think there needs to be as much training in the relation, because like you said, it stands out. And I've seen that in my own personal life where it stands out so much. I get on a conversation, 15-minute collaboration call, and they're like, wow, this is different. I thought you were going to pitch me. Like, no, man, I'm just going to see how we connect. And you're big in that, Steve. So love to unpack, because I do some things that really be able to facilitate a really good, strong, relationship right off the
Yep.
bat, where I'm asking certain questions. So I'd love to get your expert opinion. What have you done when you're having that conversation? And then how are you processing, thinking about your Rolodex, who you can connect them with, who you can add value, et cetera, et cetera. So please just unpack that for us.
Yeah. So, at the end of the day, it really comes down to your ability to ask good questions, right? And to not have the deep desire to speak more than you hear anybody else, right? And that's hard for salespeople because we're so anxious for the at bats that we sometimes have a challenge of, what I like to say is you got to have that verbal diarrhea where you're just like blurting everything out that you possibly can. And it never works out well for those situations. So you have to go in. Number one, you got to have a plan, right? Who is this person that you're meeting with? What are you hoping to accomplish? And really, it's easy for salespeople to default, well, I want to sell them, I want to get them involved in whatever I'm offering. And yeah, that could be the ultimate goal, but what are you hoping to do now? Because if you think about it, kind of in a baseball mindset, how do I get on first base? How do I get on second base? How do I go beyond that? Right. First base happens, with that first interaction, that engagement, getting to a point where you can ask some questions to give you a little bit of insight as to who that person is. So one of the things that I do is I'm fascinated by how people, what I call the origin story. On my own podcast, I talk about this, with most of my guests, is like, how did you become who you are? Right. And people are, inherently good at being experts about their story and the things that they, their journey, right? So they're really, a lot of people are not accustomed to being asked those questions. So how did you end up at this company? What do you like about your job? What drove you down this particular career path? Those three questions alone, if you just stop and let people actually answer them, you can learn so much about people and what sort of their motivations and their drive was. Does it actually tie back to your product or service? Well, it might, right? At the end of the day, I think that's the key is you've got to lay the foundation. And that foundation, believe it or not, and this is not a Jedi mind trick, but it's actual, true. When you get somebody talking about themselves and you don't say anything and you're a good listener and you're maintaining good eye contact, you're having this good interaction, back and, asking some follow-up questions, keeping them talking, they actually believe they have better rapport with you than you probably imagine, right? Because at the end of the day, they're getting to say, or talk about something that they're foremost expert on themselves. Two, you're giving them the space and time to do it. And three, you're really building that trust by asking questions with an authentic heart and really being curious about it. And so those are critical factors. I think from a strategic perspective, you have to be a sponge and you have to have this detective mindset, which means that you've got to go in really with a game plan and some well thought out questions. And then you have to be able to absorb what you're hearing and learning and get that captured somewhere, whether it's taking notes right there in the meeting. And you could just say, hey, I apologize, but there's so much good stuff. I need to write this down if you don't mind. And just jotting a few notes or capturing it as soon as you walk out of their office, or, you're done with whatever the interaction might be. I think that's a critical miss by a lot of people, is they miss all that great detail that they learned. And what I always tell people is, I look for one thing, which is really a connection point. A connection point, in my definition, is the bite-sized morsel of information you learn about that person that makes them unique to you. It's not their job title. It's not who, it's not some of the typical stuff that you would get, you're accustomed to seeing, or think you're going to walk away with from a meeting. It's the unique thing that makes that person unique to you, right? And it's going to set them apart. Could be their love of the Dallas Cowboys, or, the fact that they're season ticket holders at the UT Longhorn, football games. It could be that they're really passionate about, spending time with their kids on the weekends. Those become the opportunity for you to say, hey, look, I'm going to learn something about this, but then my follow-up is going to reference what I learned. And again, you put them on stage, you're kind of making them feel special when you first interact, but then in your follow-up, say, look, I really enjoyed hearing that story about your daughter and what you're doing on, to help her with their Girl Scout camp, or, whatever you've learned. Those people it's about hearts and minds. You're winning that over at that point, because they're like, not only did you have, no apparent agenda, but you really wanted to learn a little bit about me, but you paid attention. And now you're shining a light back on something that you learned, and you're referencing it. That dialogue, or excuse me, that connection point becomes a dialogue jumping off point to make your next interaction just that much more powerful. So those are the things that I really recommend on the front end, is really go in with that mindset of, what can I learn from this person? What can I, what can I put forward that, doesn't come across as too salesy or too pushy, but really where can I add value, and where can I contribute to them? And I always ask this question to everybody I interact with, is, how can I help you? What can I be doing to benefit you in any way, personally and professionally? And nobody ever takes you up on it the first time. They probably won't take you up on it for the fifth or sixth time. But when you become that person that everybody knows that you ask, and you have that question, and it's something that you finish up every interaction with, you will be amazed at how they respond and react to you, and just how quickly that relationship starts to grow.
And what I found so interesting in what you're saying here is, you're the initiator. You're the one that's obviously kind of facilitating this relationship aspect and asking the right
Yes.
questions. But what's so interesting is, I think you and I, we've been in the industry, you've been in it a lot longer than I have, where you've taken a lot of sales phone calls, or maybe you've been on a lot of sales phone calls. You get that one individual, and it's like literally walking you through the same questions. It's like, I know where you're going with this. What's your pain? Why did we phone call? Why did we get on this phone call? How do you feel like this product is a good fit for what you got going? It's like, oh my gosh, come on. It's that same basic stuff. Let's just have a conversation. Let's have a dialogue, and going from there. And the reason why we're both laughing is because it's happened 1,000 times. And what's so interesting
Happened to me
is,
twice this morning. So
yeah. And what's so interesting to me is, when you work with, and correct me if I'm wrong, Steve, what I've discovered is, when you're working with this higher echelon, when you're working with 8, 9, 10-figure, billion-dollar companies and CEOs and entrepreneurs, a lot of it is relational. Right. And that's
yeah,
one of the reasons why it's just having a conversation, a dialogue. They don't need to look at your website, look at all the testimonials and the case study. No, they're just having a conversation and say, hey, man, I really like you. I like
yeah.
how you're able to collaborate, connect, have a conversation, how you're always thinking. Now, Steve, I do want to talk a little bit about this in regards to value. We've heard this 1,000 times. It's almost like, hey, hashtag add value. However, though, I love your approach in regards to you actually adding value to that person in whatever their pain is. You've identified their pain. You said, hey, man, I know someone that you could help you. I don't know if that would help or not, but hey, I know someone. It's not saying, hey, Billy Bob, here's my new book. Buy it. It'll add value to you. Or
Yeah.
here's this YouTube thing that I just created, a video, whatever. So I know we're laughing about it, but I love for you to explain the difference between true value and just hashtag value.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I would say, the reality is that we all need something. I mean, you need something in your life. I need something in my life. The good, what I call ripplers, are really good at figuring out what that is, right? They're able to, cut through all the noise and the BS and figure out, okay, how do I get this person to open up? How do I build trust? And then really, how do I feel comfortable enough to ask that question and continue to ask that question in terms of how I can help you? That's where you really differentiate yourself relative to value is figuring out, you hit on something that made me smile, which was, because it's a sales technique. So what are your pain points, Mr. Prospect? I mean, tell me what's keeping you up at night. I mean, all these same tried and true kind of just lacking authentic, kind of mindset in terms of these questions. They see it coming a mile away, right? Like, well, like, why would that's your second question to me. Why would I open up to you? Right? Like, why would I tell you anything? But, the reality is that, I look at every interaction that I have, personally and professionally, as an opportunity to try and get to know somebody. And I look at this situation. I mentioned prepping before you go into a meeting. Ask yourself this question: what can I learn from this person? What questions should I be asking? What would my intended outcome be if it was, things went great? And if I feel like things aren't going the way that they should, what can I do in the moment to get us back on track and to adjust it? And one of the things that I did, and I do a lot of sales training, for organizations, and I would always tell people, like, look, I am not the best salesperson, right? I never had that, perfect strategy to get people to just automatically write me checks. I mean, just, and especially in today's world, just doesn't happen that way, right? At the end of the day, you have to figure out how to contribute to them in a way that allows them to respect what you do, trust in, you're the person that they need to be doing business with. They've got to believe in whatever the cause of the mission is that you're there for, product or service. And really, it comes down to feeling that level of rapport with the person on the other end. And I always told people, and this was kind of my killer strategy, is like, you're not buying this product, you're not buying this service, you're buying me. I am here 100% to make sure that whatever we do is going to pay off dividends in whatever that outcome might be. And I then follow that up, back it up. And I think that's where a lot of salespeople drop the ball, because they go from, oh, got this closed, I'm moving to the next transaction. And for me, it was always about, look, I'm not comfortable to move to the next opportunity until I feel like this opportunity is teed up and be like, this was the greatest decision I ever made in my life. Right. So I always do that. I feel like, especially from a business owner, entrepreneur perspective, even with my software ventures, we're always asking our customers, so what can we do to make working with us better in any way, shape, or form? We want to know, right? It's kind of like the reverse of how can I help you? But really, at the end of the day, you're opening up that door for a dialogue and a conversation with that prospect, or that, well, in our case, a customer. And they just like look at you like, do you care? I mean, really, at the end of the day, like, nobody ever asked this. And it's like, yeah, because we're not selling software. We're building relationships. We're building partnerships here. And the reality is, if you're that deeply invested in whatever it is that you're selling or whatever you're doing professionally, it comes across, it actually just oozes from you, that energy, that that authenticity, which I've talked about, that just comes across in a way that allows you to build that trust so much more. And once you have that trust, then you guard it with everything you've got, because when you've got it, that will, it'll pay dividends. You'll get more and more opportunities because of those relationships, because those folks will sing your praises and do what they can to promote you.
So let me ask you this, because, and I love what you're saying. Obviously, what you just mentioned and what you talk about in the book as well is, facilitating these right relationships so that, and correct me if I'm wrong, at the end, there is an opportunity to ask, right? There's all opportunities that come to your door, whether you're looking for them or not. But I do want to ask in regards to the power of the ask for help. A lot of entrepreneurs, it's like, okay, you know what? Hey, I got to get clear on what I'm looking for and what I'm
Yeah.
asking for. And then once you build these relationships, then you're in a situation where you feel comfortable and saying, hey, you know what, Billy Bob, I know we've known each other for a while. We've never made any money off of each other, referred any business to each other, but we just love each other. We go golfing together or whatever. Hey, and then obviously, at what point do you ask, and the power of the ask, and as well as getting clear from your relationships?
So let me make sure I understand your question. So are you asking, from your perspective, when do you actually come back and say, turn it back to a business kind of ask, hey,
So,
when
well,
are we going to do something to
it's
help each other?
yeah, well, it's either that. So what I've discovered is, like, for example, I've had a lot of people on my podcast, and it was just immense value, and I always keep in touch with them. How are you guys doing? And then I started saying, you know what, I'm looking for a lot of investors and M&As, people to interview on my podcast. So what I started doing, instead of looking for cold audience and whatever and doing a lot of outreach, I said, hey, look at my network. Hey, do you guys know anybody that's in this specific thing? And I started realizing the power of the ask, but getting very clear on that. And they're like, yeah, I know this person. Hey, I know this person. I started getting a whole bunch of warm intros. And now all of a sudden it was solved the problem. And so I guess that's kind of really what it comes down to, is really facilitating the ask. So it's not, hey, maybe I'm going directly to you. And what I've discovered in sales, or like relationships, I may not be saying, hey, this is my product, I want to sell you. It's more of, hey, who do you know? And then a lot of times they actually raise their own hand. But I just was wondering if you felt the same way in that regard.
Yeah, no, I do. I think at the end of the day, the ultimate goal is obviously to get to that point where you can, make any kind of connection, fruitful, right? In some capacity, in some way. And I find that people often rush that too quickly. And then you've kind of just undone all the great work, that all that foundation you laid, you just kicked it all the way back down to the ground. And so I think the big caution that I would have is that, when you feel like, you have the rapport and you build the relationship with that prospect that's now turned into a customer, or that great connection that maybe hasn't done business with you yet, but they really respect and admire, and you keep asking that question, how can I help you? I tend to believe that it takes between 3 and 6 times before of trying to do that, giving before you can feel comfortable to ask. I know that seems like a crazy amount of time, and it can be, depending on how often you see this person, how often you communicate with them, which is all the more reason why, when you have this mindset, if you're doing it continually through all the people that you're interacting with and you've brought into your network personally or professionally, you've always got somebody to be sort of, stimulating that opportunity to continue to ask for help. But for someone that maybe you're not going to see all that often, you're not in that town because you don't see that customer all that time, and your interactions are pretty minor, it can seem like it takes a long time. But the reality is, once you've done it and you feel like you've got to this point, you can actually just test that, and you can just say, look, let me ask you a question. If you were to hear somebody in your network that needs, something, close to what I do or what I offer, would I be the first person that you'd think of, and would you refer me? Not asking for a referral, I'm not even asking, but I really want to make sure, because it's important to me that I add enough value to the people that I interact with, that I've brought into my personal and professional network, that you guys that are, considered important to me. Yeah, you're someone that's important to me. I want to make sure that I feel like that, I've added enough value to you that you feel confident enough to put my name forward. And I'm not, again, asking for it. It's kind of like you're subtly saying, hey, look, here's an opportunity for you to kind of help me, without actually saying, here's a way for you to help me. And if you've been consistent and congruent every single time that you follow up, well, they know that's kind of you've got that servant mindset. You're doing it yourself. And so then they kind of feel like, oh man, I need to kind of step up my game. I really do need to help Steve out, or I really should be thinking about people that, that I know that could benefit him, as opposed to the traditional. I just had this with someone who has sold us insurance for a lot of years. Giving a little bit of an excuse because, for COVID, but the lack of communication, the lack of just staying in contact, except for renewal time, kind of bothered me, kind of annoyed me a little bit. And then out of the blue, asked for a cup of coffee, get together for a coffee. I got together, and I was curious as to what it was going to be. I figured it was going to be a pitch of some sort, or my rates are going up, or something bad's about to happen. Right. And he said, look, you've got such a great network. I really need to know some of the people in your network. And I really need to, I want to up my sales game, and I want to, get more, quality opportunities in the door. And I sat there and I said, well, let me ask you a question. do you feel like you've done enough to build a relationship with me to then have me open up my, as you said, the Rolodex, right? My LinkedIn, my address book. And he's like, oh yeah, I think I have. And I said, well, let's just look at the last couple of years. I've only heard from you when it's renewal time, and with the exception of this particular meeting, which I appreciate. But then I ended up buying the coffee. So it's like I seemed a little unbalanced, right? But do you feel like just checking in with me once a year, at the time that it's we're gonna have to write this check, is the best way to grow the relationship, especially given, and of course he sells me for my software company, right? But he does know me as this Ripple persona as well. So he knows relationships are front and center. And he looked and he hadn't even contemplated it. And I said, look, I'm not trying to be a jerk. I'm just saying, look, on par with how I am and what I go about and how I conduct myself. I'm just asking, you feel like you're bringing that same level of intention to the table, or are you just looking to get to my network so you can sell more insurance? And he said, well, obviously that's what I was hoping. And, that's where, I sort of now see kind of the error of my ways. And it's like, look, it's not even an error. I'm just trying to correct you from making a similar mistake with an even more important client, right? You got to put in the work. You got to put in the time and the effort in it. And it's a huge, huge, time suck in a lot of ways to build relationships that way. But it's so critical and so important. I know the guy, I like his business. I like the company that they represent, but I'm not going to just pick up my, list of contacts on LinkedIn and say, hey, you need to go meet with this guy because he's great, because you haven't built enough of that relationship with me to warrant that. And so I think to a certain degree, that was like a big wake up call for him, because at the end of the day, he realized, you just can't grow your business that way. Maybe 10, 20 years ago, maybe you could have done it a little bit like that, but not to the level of, especially the kinds of connections I have in my network. This is not going to work. So that's just kind of an important aspect. I think a lot of people lose sight of when they start to, figure out how to grow those relationships, build those sales pipelines, and how people pay attention and how important that is to whether they are informed enough to want to continue to do business with you, much less refer you.
This is so important. And one of the things I really want to foot stop and see, I really appreciate you sharing that story, because, as networkers that have big, Rolodex, if you will, we can explode someone's business with kind of our connections and networks, which is fun. But also you're very, very protective over your Rolodex and your network and your relationships, which you should be, because I
Yeah.
have been in situations where I actually warmly introduce someone, and the first phone call, instead of and I'm big on relationships because I understand the importance of it. The first phone call, and I like warmly introduced like 15 people anyways, and they all came back to me and said, hey, this guy's trying to sell me right off the bat. I'm thinking, no way, is he really? And I
Yeah.
said,
Then you
oh,
feel bad about it because you put
and
this in motion, right?
exactly. And I had to actually cut off that relationship very, very quickly. And I said, hey man, I can't warmly introduce you to people if you're just thinking you're going to close all these people. These people are high caliber. I mean, like you mentioned, 8, 9, $billion. And it's like you can't just they want to have a relationship first, and you've got to
Well,
focus on that.
and
And
I
go
would say,
ahead.
well, Christian, on that front, just one thing is, when you're lucky that person called you, because a lot of times the damage is getting done and it's to your relationship and you don't even know it, right? So that's a big factor.
Oh, 100%. And that's why you have to be very, very stringent. And I actually have, whenever I connect someone, I'm always very say, hey, this is how I want you to, treat this relationship. Make sure you're relational, make sure you have a conversation. I'm not expecting you to sell this. So it's just seeing if there's a synergistic relationship or whatever. And I have to actually say that. It's unbelievable how many times I have to say that to people. And it's like, oh my gosh. But anyways, I appreciate you kind of dive into this. Now, you did mention something here, and I want to talk a little bit about this. Um, how to prioritize relationships while in the growth stage, because like you mentioned, it is a pull. right? I think it's almost like divergent, right? It's, hey, if I want to scale and grow, I have to automate. And sometimes I lose that relational aspect. Definitely as a CEO, we've heard, hey, we want to work on our business, not work in our business. All these things, it's like it almost
Yeah.
pulls ourselves away from working with the client as well as our team, because you have operations and systems. So I love for you to tell us a little bit how you can still be very intentional. I think it's a misconception. You can still be very relational and prioritize relationships, but also be in that growth stage and not just treat them as a number. So I'd love for you to talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, well, I talk to every CEO and I tell them, you hear that advice all the time. You need to be working, on your business, not in your business. And relationships are on your business. I mean, that's 100% the aspect of what you need to be looking at as the CEO. In fact, your priorities as the top executive should be spending the vast majority of your time talking to existing customers, helping that sales team or that organization close those prospects, showing and extending the kind of culture that you're trying to build within the organization, which is all paramount to that relationship, that partnership that you're trying to create with your prospect, right? And I think that you divide that time somewhat into thirds, right? A third of that time is spent helping your organization potentially close new opportunities and being front and center and involved. I do that with my sales team or my organization with my software company, mainly because I want people to know, hey, look, if this person is not available, you call me. You got questions about the company, our culture, our direction, what we're going to do once you say yes, I want you to bring those to me because this is my reputation, right? It's the company and our performance, the buck stops here, right? So that's one aspect. The other third of the time, I think CEOs need to be spending time on the customers you've already closed, continuing to grow and build those relationships. And it's at every end of the organization, CEO to CEO for those companies, all of their top executive team. You ask them who within your organization would you recommend I get to know and try to build a relationship with? Not because we want to sell more product or services to it, but because we may be able to add some continual value, right? Some other opportunities to expand and grow this relationship more so than just the financial transaction, right? So I think that's an important aspect. And then the other, real third of the time, those CEOs need to be engaging with other CEOs in non-competitive industries, right? Building that network of other folks that are happening. I mean, you touched on it early on, but being a CEO, a president, top level executive, it is the most isolating and lonely position you can have. And I think one of the things that you will, do yourself good is if you're in that role is to go find other people that are in the same role, but in other industries. And, that wisdom of crowds, if you can build some momentum with other CEOs and other executives, and you start to cultivate those relationships, guaranteed there's going to be strategies and brainstorming opportunities for you. There's going to be a resource for you when things aren't going well. When things are going well, there's a network to share it, because those folks want to cheer you on and see you be successful, and you want to contribute back what you've got, your skills and abilities. That's so huge. And I think that that's essential, right? I think at the end of the day, it's really, really critical. And you touched on sort of that point, like on the introduction. I want to go back to that for 1 second, just because I think it sort of ties in here. Every interaction that you have is intentional. So you go back to like, hey, you made that introduction, right? And say, hey, look, I'm putting you two together because I think there's some synergy or some value. I make those introductions by email. And then the person that is going to benefit the most from that interaction, I set the expectation, just like you kind of mentioned, is like, hey, look, you can't be selling them. You can't be trying to do this or that. But I say, hey, look, I'm going to be following up on this. I'm going to see that you guys get together. I'm going to see that you guys have the interaction, and I'm going to ask how this goes, because I don't take the responsibility of interacting at that level lightly, because it's my reputation that's at front and center. And I think actually you take that same mindset back into those interactions that I just said, is how do you split those times into thirds? You do the same thing in that regard. It's like, look, my time is critical and important, and I'm spending it here because I want to know what's going on, what we can do if you're a prospect to earn your business an opportunity, to give us that chance to build that trust. And when the top person, when she shows up and says, hey, look, I am the ultimate person within this organization and I'm here to serve you, so what can I do, Mr. or Miss Prospect? That says something. And then when those customers who have already paid you the money or are already enjoying your product or service or whatever, they're hearing back from you and saying, what can we do to make this better? Oh my God, you're cementing that relationship. You're building even more value. You're insulating them from looking at competition. And then really, when you're starting out as a CEO or executive and you're reaching out to other people, very simple to find them on LinkedIn, but like, hey, look, I am interested in building relationships with people that are doing similar things in different industries. We all go through all these challenges. There's always going to be dark times. There's always going to be the need for some, motivation and some new ideas. And I believe that they come from people that are doing similar jobs in different industries. And I was curious if you'd like to get together and get acquainted and see if there's some value here. And I know that and be, almost a little self-effacing. It's like, I know my job is lonely as hell. And I often feel like I could really use somebody to vent to or to celebrate with, or maybe just bounce ideas off of. And that's really what I'm committed to doing. So would you be open to that? I think once you do that, you just watch your business start to really explode.
I love that, man. I love that. I love how you just like, hey, man, I'm not looking to buy, sell anything. I just want to, have someone to bounce ideas off. And I just think it's so cool. I love what you even talked about. I wrote that down. Just tremendous amount of notes throughout this conversation. Follow up with the introduction, say, hey, how did that go? I love that. Love that. Just a little tidbit there. Steve, man, I just appreciate the conversation, but also I love just how you're focused on the relational aspect. And it's so funny. It doesn't matter how many times we can say it or how many times someone listens to it. People just think short term, they think transactional, because at the end of the day they need money now, they need this, and you lose out so many other opportunities and just growth and business and so forth if you don't really you know figure out and be intentional with this relational aspect and what you're talking about in the ripple effect. Steve, how can our audience reach out to you and be part of what you got going on, my man?
Yeah, well, so you can find me on LinkedIn. Let me know that you heard this podcast, because that would be awesome. I will tell Christian every single person that reaches out to me. You can follow me on LinkedIn. Don't invite me to connect until we get to know each other, though. So I will say you can follow me, but we can interact that way, because I've got my profile set up so I can receive messages, email, etc. You can go to my website, ripplecentral.com, and see all the great stuff that we're doing there, just to get an idea and perspective of sort of the approach that I take, where you can learn more about my book, my podcasts. We're going to get Christian on the Ripple Effect podcast very soon. So, he may not realize that, but he's going to be, he's got to be a guest. But, I put a lot of emphasis and effort into those locations. But, LinkedIn gives you kind of an understanding of all that I've got going on. But, Ripple's my passion, helping organizations identify, develop, and grow the key relationships that they depend on for their success is really my passion, right? And whether it's an organization that's looking to go to the next level, whether it's building those internal relationships and creating that culture of connected individuals, creating that is super big priority for me. Or if you're just an individual, like, hey, look, I have probably been doing my network building the wrong way all these years, and I know that I'm leaving money on the table because I'm not building these relationships that are adding value. And I know I lack authenticity. I know that there is no real consistent value, whether it's in my LinkedIn or whether it's in my prospects or even my customers. We sit down and talk about a coaching relationship and figure out, how to get you on track. I promise you that, this is not pie in the sky, and this is not woo-woo kind of approach. This is relational development of growing the relationships that are so critical to you. And I think it's important that people really start, like you said, Christian, put the time, emphasis, and focus on it, and you will see the benefits of it. It will come back to you tenfold, I promise.
Huge, man, huge. And guys, those links will be in the description below. So again, like here at our community here, listen to Journey with Christian D. Evans podcast. We are big action takers. So make sure you stop what you're doing. You click on that link and learn more, and obviously be in Steve's ecosystem. He's literally teaching you how to do this. And yes, like you talked about, there's so many different opportunities, so many things that you're missing out just because you're focusing on the short term and not the long-term strategy. Steve, I just appreciate the immense value that you brought today and diving into all this stuff and putting into this book of years upon years upon years of experience, and just how protective you are about your ecosystem, but also the value that you can bring. Steve, I always love to ask our guests before we let you go fully, is there any last words of wisdom they'd like to share with our audience?
I would just say that every connection that you make has the potential to lead to something great. If you take the time, put in the energy, and you don't just try and get the payoff right now. You invest in figuring out how you can add value when and where you can, and create those positive ripples where when and where you can for those individuals. It will come back to you in ways that you can't possibly imagine. And I guess probably my last bit of wisdom is, the right people will show up in your path exactly at the time that they're supposed to. But if you're walking around and you're focused only on this phone or device, or you're in your own head and you're not looking up and looking out, you're going to miss them. So don't do that. So that would be the last bit of wisdom I'd kind of share.
So valuable, guys. That is the CEO and founder of SWAT Vision and author of The Ripple Effect, Steve Harper. Guys, that is Journey with Christian D. Evans podcast. Until next time, be uncommon if you can.